Well, good morning. Great to see so many people here this morning, and a warm welcome to those people online who are now joining us. We give you a very warm welcome to our service as well. So we had our harvest service last week. So we're back to our series called The Living a Liberated Life. And as Ian said, the subject for this week is through better looking. I could just stand here and be a good illustration, couldn't I? But I won't do that. Matthew 18, verses 10 to 14 is the reading that I've been given, so we'll see where we go on all of this. So there was a female student, and she'd just done her exams, and she was about to think about going off to university. And she was at home one night with her parents having a meal, and suddenly she sobs, and she says, "I'm pregnant." Well, father, what? You're pregnant? And he was going a little bit, up and down, pacing up and down. And who is this guy? And how old is he? And where does he live? And I'm going to go and sort him out. And Mum was frantically thinking about, who's going to look after this baby while my daughter's at university? And all of these things were going through their minds. There was tension, there were arguments, there were tears. And then suddenly, after about an hour, the daughter said, Okay, quiet. I'm not pregnant. I just wanted to put it into a better perspective when I tell you that I only got a C in English. So there we go. Looking at things from a different perspective makes all the difference, doesn't it? You see, the student had calculated that if her parents saw the situation from a different angle, they would accept the exam results so much better. Getting a C in English became so much more accepting, knowing she wasn't pregnant. But I wonder, from what angle do we look at God this morning? From what angle do we look at ourselves this morning? And from what angle do we look at other people? And that's really where we're going to go today. We're going to be doing better looking at God, better looking at ourselves, better looking at others. And obviously we can only take a glimpse of these things, and hopefully we'll be helped by it. So, better looking at God. When we look at God first in our lives and see his ways, it helps us to look at ourselves better as well as other people better. It gets it into perspective. Jesus himself said, didn't he? Seek first God, and then everything else will make so much more sense in life. And firstly, as we look at God, we can see that his view is so much different from the world's view in general. The world says, be the strongest, be the richest, be the best looking. These are the important things in life. Whereas God says, having a heart that is focused on him and his ways is so much more important. And we can see evidence of this in the book of 2 Samuel. Most of you know the story about Samuel. Sam to me, we're good friends. He went to appoint the second king of Israel, Saul being the first. And he went off to the family of Jesse, and he got the brothers to stand in a line. And of course, the first one, the oldest one, he looked the strongest, the tallest, the brightest. He had everything going for him. And Samuel said to God, surely this is the next king of Israel. But when we read 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, it says this, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And as we know, if we know the story, it was actually the youngest and the smallest of the sons who became the next king of Israel. David, the shepherd boy, who became king. And as Christians, when our hearts are focused on God and his ways, he sees a strength in us. He sees a richness in us. he sees a beauty in us that perhaps the world doesn't quite see or understand. And also as Christians, we might feel that we are very much in the minority in the world around us. But through God's eyes, things are very different. You know, there's a lovely story in 2 Kings chapter 6. Elisha was God's prophet at the time. And Elisha and his servant find themselves trapped in a town. The king of Aram is fed up with what Elisha is doing, and he sold his soldiers off, and they surround Elisha and his servant. And the servant looks up, and all he can see are these soldiers around him. And he turns into a bit like Fraser on Dad's Army when he says, "We're doomed, we're doomed." Is that how he goes? Something like that. But Elisha says to his servant, he says, "But there are so many more people on our side than what you can see." And he prays that his servant's eyes will be opened. And as he opens his eyes, his spiritual eyes, what he actually sees is chariots and horses all around in the hills on the horizon. And so Elisha prays this, and God's unseen to the human eye army of angels in that story come and they strike down Elisha's enemies with blindness, so that he and his servant could escape and be liberated. It's a wonderful story. But in Romans 8, verse 31, it sort of like just echoes this story. Paul writes, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" You see, looking at God and seeing things from his perspective is totally different. You know, Christians, take heart. We are never in the minority because God is for us and with us. And this has been my favorite verse from the day I became a Christian. And it's helped me no end in life. And then as we look at the parable in today's reading, we're going to look at it in a minute, we see a picture of God who goes after this wandering sheep, which gives us a picture of his love, care, and sacrifice to the individual. And we can see that God's love and care is for everyone. So we're going to read now from Matthew 18, verses 10 to 14, and it's entitled, "The Parable of the Wandering Sheep." "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." Our reading is a picture of God. It says a man there, but it's a picture of God as a shepherd, earnestly seeking and searching for a wandering sheep. Last week, Andy spoke at our harvest service on Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd," a psalm that clearly shows us that God loves us and cares for us. It shows us that he seeks to provide for us and protect us. And in our parable today, it also shows us that God gives us freedom. He gives us a free will. And he allows us to wander. But he is always, always looking out for us. Everyone is important to him. And when we look at God and his ways first, as Christians, we can feel liberated knowing that he is with us. So that's a glimpse at God. Loads of things we could have said more. But what about looking at ourselves? What do you see when you look at yourself? And more importantly, what does God see? And in order for us to understand why Jesus told this parable and to put it into context, we need to know about the previous 9 verses. So what happens in Matthew 18, verses 1 to 9? I'll try and go back. There we go. So Matthew 18, verses 1 to 9. We see the disciples coming to Jesus, and they're having an argument as to who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus invites a small child to come and stand amongst them. And Jesus gives this answer: anyone who humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus gives a very severe warning: not to cause one of these little ones to stumble in their faith. You see, Jesus has given a picture that everyone is important and that no one is to be pushed to one side, neglected, or thought of as unimportant. So as we look at ourselves, what do we see? Are we like the disciples in this chapter who are arguing amongst themselves, trying to get their own way, trying to be better than the other, thinking of themselves rather than others? There's this self-promotion going on. And Jesus says the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the one who humbles himself like a child. You see, a child trusts, a child seeks help, and a child depends on their carer or carers. They don't feel trapped by the pressures and worries of life. And for us, trusting in God, seeking help from him, and depending on him rather than ourselves can be liberating. God wants us to depend on him rather than do things in our own strength. And when I look back on my own life, I can clearly see that the times where God has used me most are the times when I have been at my weakest and depended on him more. And I can give you illustrations, to prove that point. When a child turns into a teenager, it's not long before they think that they know it all. We've probably all been there, whether as a teenager ourselves or as a parent. Dad, Mum, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to say, I always thought TikTok was a clock. But this can carry on into our adult lives, can't it? Where we can become more self-dependent, where we can become more selfish, and pride can take over. To become a Christian in the first place, we have to humble ourselves like a child. We have to admit to God that we have done wrong in our lives and ask for his forgiveness. We have to accept what Jesus has done for us by dying on a cross for us and taking the punishment we deserved upon himself. And we need to accept him into our lives and seek to follow him and his ways. Have we all done that? Have we all done that? And there may be somebody here this morning who has never made that decision to follow Christ in their lives. Don't let pride get in the way and stop you. Humble yourself like a child. Ask Jesus into your life and experience the wonder of being part of his wonderful family. And if I'm talking to someone here this morning where you're thinking, gosh, that's me, and you'd love to take that step, then I would invite you to come and have a word with me afterwards, and I would dearly love to pray with you. And what about those of us who are already living the Christian life? I'm going to say, how are we doing? Are we selfish or are we giving? Are we proud or are we humble? In James 4, verse 6, it says these words, God opposes the proud, but he shows favor to the humble. And then in Matthew 23, we read, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. You see, there is freedom and liberation in being humble, and when we are not tied to our own selfish ways. And this leads me on to our third point, to look better at others. You see, this child that Jesus brought in front of him was being neglected, cast to one side, and seen as not important, possibly because they thought that children should be seen and not heard. But Jesus gives a very stern warning to any who neglects this child or hinders the child from coming to him, and who causes a child to stumble in their faith. And this is why it leads into our reading today, and the first verse of our reading, where it says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. You see, it's not just the great prophet Elisha who had angels helping him. It's everyone in his kingdom, every child of God. Now, I don't believe that Jesus is just talking about children here. I believe the child represents those who are vulnerable and needy in our congregations, those who are neglected and marginalized, those who have left church and who are struggling with their faith. And as Christians, we have a responsibility not to look down on people, but to look out and to care for them. Better looking out for others. And when Jesus brought that child in front of him, he was also implying, don't stop this child from growing in their faith. Don't hinder them. And I believe that can mean adults as well as children. So I wonder, do we encourage or do we discourage people in their faith, especially the young? You know, I was in my mid-20s. I'd only been speaking for a couple of years, and I was speaking at another church, and I spoke, and a lady came up to me at the end of that service. And she said to me, Colin, I don't think that you should ever speak again. She said, your sermon isn't meaty enough, and I don't think you've got the gift of speaking. And it was crushing. I was in my early 20s. I could have stopped speaking there and then. And I had to go and examine myself before God to see if I was doing the right thing. And he told me exactly what he told me in the first place. Actually, I wasn't called to do meaty sermons. I was called to do sermons that people could understand. And thankfully, God confirmed that I should carry on. Interesting, isn't it, that church has invited me back to speak every year for the last 35 years. And I think sometimes we criticize in church because we only see things from our point of view. We have our own agenda. You see, my speaking style didn't appeal to that lady, and that's fair enough. But it didn't mean that it was wrong to do. Do we restrict ourselves by wanting to see church and individuals fall in line with our own agenda? Or can we be liberated by being open to God's agenda for his church? This church over the years has predominantly been a hugely caring, loving, and encouraging church. I certainly wouldn't be here today if that wasn't the case. Without the love and care and encouragement from so many people in this church. You know, I've got some of my Sunday school teachers in here this morning, would you believe? Without their encouragement and what they did over the years, I wouldn't be here. From the age of 3 years old, I've been in this church. It's been such an encouraging and caring church for me. And there's nothing better to encourage someone in their faith, is there? And to see them grow closer to God and being used by him. It's so liberating. You know, Ian will tell you, youth work, I did youth work for 13 years myself, led it in this church. It's fantastic to see a youngster coming in at 13 or whatever, and to see them going off in their 20s, serving God on fire for God. It's so liberating to be part of that, encouraging other people. But when someone is discouraged in the church, it can be so damaging. A wrong word or a wrong sentence can bring a halt to someone's faith, and their potential and giftings are never seen. I wonder, do we encourage others or do we discourage others? And I wonder how many people have left this church over the years because they were discouraged or because they were neglected or not involved. They were halted in their faith. Right, back to the parable. There we go. There is a wandering sheep missing, and it's a picture of someone missing in our church family. And we must not get confused with the other parable of the lost sheep found in Luke 15. Did you know there are 2 parables of the lost sheep? I bet you didn't. I bet you thought when you looked at those 2 parables, they are exactly the same parable. And I must admit, I probably did too. In Luke 15, Jesus is criticized. It's a different story altogether. He's criticized for eating with tax collectors and sinners and spending time with them. The Pharisees were criticizing him. And he tells the parable of the lost sheep to explain that he has come to seek and save the lost. You see, it's evangelical. It's looking out for the lost sheep. Whereas the parable we are looking at today is pastoral, and it refers to a person wandering off away from their faith. There are differences between the 2 parables. So why have people wandered away from the faith? They may have wandered away because they were marginalized or discouraged. They may have been neglected or looked down upon. They may have got into difficulties and suffering in some way. Maybe the pressures of life are choking them, or they might have just got fed up with church. It happens. People can get fed up with church. Jesus shows that through this parable, every person is important to God. The time, the effort, the cost, the commitment of going after that one person, whoever they might be. But both parables are similar in that it takes a going out to seek the lost or the wanderer. And while church and meeting together are hugely important for us as Christians, we should never be restricted by church activities only. Notice in our story how all the other sheep are also wandering on the hills, but they are still connected together. They are liberated. They're not restricted to a sheepfold. And it can be liberating for us to go out and spend time with an unbeliever and see them closer to God. Ask Simon how liberating he loves it. And he's going to go, and he's so enthusiastic about it. It's so liberating to be able to hard work, but liberating to go and to share something of God in these people's lives. It can be liberating to go out and to see someone struggling in their faith and to go out and to encourage them and to include them, to bring them back closer to God. And sometimes that might mean not being restricted by church activity, but freeing ourselves up. So, I'm going to leave you with a couple of challenges now. And these are your challenges. Maybe for this week, don't get restricted by this week. It's a continuing challenge, okay? Who am I going to contact this week who I haven't seen at church for a while? Wouldn't it be great if 100 of us contacted someone this week to find out how someone is doing? Wouldn't it be good if the same person got... No. Second challenge. Who am I going to encourage in their faith this week? Whether it be a youngster, teenager, or even an older person. You know, no one's exempt. Who am I going to encourage in the faith this week? And then maybe one to think about ongoing is this question here. How can I show God's love to someone who feels marginalized and on the fringe of church, or someone who has left church? How can I be inclusive? What can I do? What practical steps can I take to just gather people in and to help people and to encourage a person? That's some challenges there, isn't it? But worth thinking about and worth putting answers down and praying about as to how you can talk to people and what to say. And pray before you do so first. And we might be amazed by the results. You know, after the Queen's death, there were many interesting stories that came out about her. And one such story was told by one of her former Royal Protection officers. His name was Richard Griffin. And he knew the Queen really well, and he would often go for walks with her. And on this occasion, they were on the Balmoral estate, walking across the land. And two American hikers actually came and bumped into them. But it became obvious that they didn't recognize who the Queen was. And so they get talking away, and they asked the Queen where she lives, and she said, London. And she said, but I have got a holiday home just over the hills, a bit far from here. And so they said, oh, great. They said, how long have you been coming up here? She said, oh, most of my life, and, well over 80 years now. And they said, well, if you've been coming up here that long, you must have met the Queen. And she said, no, I haven't met the Queen, but Richard here has. And so they go on, their focus is now on Richard, and they're saying, oh, Richard, they say, well, what is the Queen like? And because he knew her quite well, he said, well, she's a bit cantankerous, but she has got a good sense of humour. And so they're just, oh, well, this man knows the Queen. And so the adult, the man, he goes up to Richard and he puts his arm around him and he gives his camera to the Queen and said, can you take a picture of me and Richard? Because he's seen the Queen, So anyway, the Queen takes this picture, and Richard, in his grace, he takes the camera off the Queen, and he says to the couple, he says, look, go and stand next to this lady and have your picture taken with her, And so they take the picture, they take the camera back, and they completely go off oblivious that they've ever met the Queen, But somewhere along the line, there is a picture to prove it if they ever look at it, okay? But the point is this, you see, they missed out on the important. They concentrated on Richard as he was the one who had met the Queen rather than the Queen herself. Are we missing out on what is important to God? Are we seeing things from God's agenda or our own agenda? Are we seeing God for who he truly is or from what the world thinks? Are we living as God wants us to live? And are we looking out for others? For these are the important things to God. Amen. I think Pam's going to lead us in